I turned over a bright metal shell that rippled when
She says human longing for mystery leads to a commonality of belief in immortality.
Dad's late or I'm early. Either way, I have time to scout the pens. Kim's
Redemption and claustrophobia, what artists understand. Not valuing the
My name is Sarah Fairchild, and I was actually born in Wahoo, Nebraska, and lived in Ceresco when I was little, but I don't remember anything until I lived in Norfolk and lived there most of my life. And then I went to college at Doane College in Crete, and after I graduated, I moved here. And I have a master's from the University of Nebraska, and I teach at Union College and at Southeast Community College. I teach English classes of various kinds. It's had an enormous influence on my writing because it's had an enormous impact on how I view things. And I'm very much a plains person. If I go to the mountains, I feel like, oh, there's things in the way between me and the sky, so it feels out of place. But I have always enjoyed seeing nature up close, and I've always enjoyed the horizon and the rolling hills, and I've always thought this was a great place to be. Probably the first person who was really influential was my grandmother, because she used to be an English teacher, and she wrote poetry, and she always encouraged me and kept a little book of the poems I wrote. And my mother also wrote poems, so that was encouraging. And when I was in high school, I entered a contest sponsored by the National Council of Teachers of English and the state of Pennsylvania. This was during the bicentennial, and you had to enter something. It could be a poem or a art project or anything. And so I sent in a poem, and it won first in the state, and then they paid my trip and my family's trip to Pennsylvania, where we got to actually come within that close, maybe further, to the president, and we're escorted around by the Secret Service, and I won $2,500 there. So that was a big encouragement. I started sort of writing before I even could write, because I always told my mom stories, and then as soon as I learned how to write, I could write those things down. I used to escape to the basement where no one could find me and sit and write. A burning urge to write. Yeah, that's a good way to put it. And I can't remember never having that. And how do I satisfy it? I write my journal, and then also by writing poems. Sometimes I get too busy doing other things like supporting myself that I don't write as much as I like, but I have to keep coming back to writing or I'm off center. Nature inspires me to write, and people's personalities, intricate personalities, their quirks, and also reading or hearing poetry makes me want to write. I don't know if I have a particular voice or style, because I'm always experimenting with new ways to do things. And a poem that I write today might sound nothing like what I wrote last week. Yeah, I don't set off like this is going to be my theme, but I do tend to write a lot, not necessarily about nature, but using natural images, or writing somehow about people, telling stories that reflect on their character or something. My husband and I had decided to form this company, Black Star Press, and we wanted to publish poetry, and we were sitting around discussing ideas about what we should publish, and we knew, of course, that poetry books don't usually make a big profit, and actually you'd be really lucky to have them pay for themselves. And so I don't know how we came up with the idea to do a calendar, because it's a little bit more useful and people look at it every day, and we thought, well, maybe that'll sell a little better, and it actually pays for itself, so that seems to work. There isn't a formal theme, but as I am reading through the potential poems and start pulling some things together, I see some recurrent themes and some images that recur. So it does help me make my final decision which poems to use, but it's still not a formal theme. Yes, keep writing, and don't let the critics make you stop writing. And also read what other people are doing, because it helps you grow. As a writer, I want to write more poems. I've barely begun a collection that's been going around in my mind for years. I have the starter poem now, so I want to continue with that group. And I also have some children's stories I want to, now that I've let them sit a while, go back and revise and send out. So I guess those are the two goals I have.
All right, good evening. My name's Alicia Graybill, and I'd like to welcome you to the Jane Pope Geske Heritage Room of Nebraska Authors. This is the 128th program of the John H. Ames Reading Series. The Heritage Room is a special collection dedicated to preserving and promoting works by and about Nebraska authors. Currently, we have a collection of over 11,000 volumes written by more than 3,000 published authors from Nebraska. In an effort to promote these authors, the Heritage Room, along with the Nebraska Literary Heritage Association, sponsors the John H. Ames Reading Series to bring authors and audience together in a local setting. I would particularly like to thank the Nebraska Literary Heritage Association, because it is through an endowment established through their volunteer efforts that we are able to bring you programs like these. We are truly grateful to them. I welcome and encourage all of you to visit our collection during regular public service hours, so you can experience the many treasures and resources the Heritage Room has to offer. Tonight's reading is by Sarah Fairchild and friends. Sarah Fairchild has an impressive literary resume. A graduate of Doane with a master's from UNL, Sarah has had her work published in Whole Notes, Plain Song, Dragonfly, Brussels Sprout, Inkstone, St. Judith Light, and The Lyric. She's also been a reader for the Prairie Schooner, on the staff of the Great Plains Quarterly, teaches creative writing at Southeast Community College, and English at Union College, as some of you know. Most importantly, Sarah is currently editor of Black Star Press. That fact is significant tonight because Black Star Press is the publisher of the Nebraska Poets Calendar. The Nebraska Poets Calendar is a wonderful publication to spotlight local talent that may still be flying under the radar of regional fame. The title Nebraska Poets Calendar is a bit misleading, as poetry is only a small part of the appeal of the calendar. Equally important is the artwork that appears on the pages. I cannot stress enough how important the work Sarah does is, because what she does is offer hope to many unpublished poets and artists out there who have yet to see their work reach a wide audience. Hope springs eternal is the old saw, but sometimes hope must be nurtured back to health. Being an aspiring writer myself, I've occasionally needed my own hope to be nurtured. Sarah Fairchild is one of those who do the nurturing. Beyond her publishing duties, Sarah is a writer herself, and this gives her a special empathy for the contributors to her calendar. Tonight, Sarah will be reading some of her own poetry, and she will be introducing some poets whose work has appeared in the calendar. I will leave that task in her capable hands. For now, however, please join me in issuing a warm Ames Series welcome to Sarah Fairchild.
Hello, I've been asked to talk about the Nebraska Poets Calendar and invite some friends. So I brought Lucy Adkins and Bob King. I've also invited Charles Fort from Kearney, and it doesn't look like he's here yet, but I hope he comes yet. People often ask me how we got the idea to start the Nebraska Poets Calendar. And actually it was one of those moments where my husband and I were both brainstorming together, and I don't know whose idea it was because we were both talking to each other. But we wanted to support Nebraska poetry and show people how wonderful the poets can be. And we decided that that publishing little books of poetry means that they, first of all, they're not sold very well, and they often someone buys them and then they go on a shelf and you see the spine. So we wanted something that would get the poetry more visible. So then we thought of the Nebraska Poets Calendar, where we match poetry by a Nebraska poet with art by a Nebraska artist. And that way it's a useful item. People have it in front of them every day. I know that there's people who hang it in their bathroom and in their kitchen, and it's just something that goes along with the day for them. So that seems to be a successful idea, whoever had it. Let's see. When we first started, we had the idea, I think it was right during a writers' conference at the university, and we had the idea one day and made up flyers and took them to the writers' conference the next day and passed them out asking for poetry. And this was in late fall, and we had to have them out before Christmas. So the whole thing happened kind of whiz-bang the first year and has kind of developed from there. The first few years I ended up, we did the layout on the computer, and then I ended up printing them on our own photocopier, which is an old monster beast. It doesn't even really work anymore. But we could run them through the first side, and then, they're printed on both sides. So in order to print the second side of each page, I had to stand there and manually feed in each sheet to make sure that all the pages were printed on both sides. It was a laborious process, and I kind of hurt my feet while I was standing there, so we eventually decided it's easier to hire a printer to do that for us. Besides, they do a better job. Over the years, the calendar was started actually in 1994, which means we got the idea in 93. So this is actually the 8th year that the calendar has been published, and it doesn't seem like it's been that long, but I guess I just approach it year by year rather than thinking of it over a span of time. Over the 8 years, though, I was counting today, and there have been 41 different Nebraska poets featured in the calendar, and there's more poets who I personally know of that ought to be in there too. And I always know that there's more good poets out there that I haven't heard of. So it's really exciting to find out how many good poets live in Nebraska. We actually have more artists who've been in the calendar than we have poets. I didn't stop and count that, but I stopped when it got more than 41. So, and I wasn't very far through the years. One of the unique features of our calendar, as opposed to most poetry books, is that the artwork that matches somehow the poems that are selected. So we select one poem from one poet to feature for each page of the calendar, and then we find artwork that somehow complements or dances with the poem. So it might echo a similar idea or pick up on a theme. It might express a similar emotion. And it doesn't always illustrate exactly. Illustration is, you take this work and this picture is exactly what that is, and that's not how we do it. Often we match the poem to already existing artwork, but sometimes we've asked artists to create artwork specifically for certain poems, and they seem to enjoy doing that. And I've been told that one of the effects of having the picture by the poem is that it adds another layer to the poem, so that it's like a reader's interpretation of the poem visually next to the poem, and then you bring, of course, your own understanding to both of those. Some of the difficulties that we've had through the years, besides getting sore feet, was, well, expense, but we have, we can't really pay for the printer until we've sold the calendars. It always works on a shoestring budget, but it does work. And the calendar always seems to at least pay for itself, if not, if it doesn't pay for much more than that. Other problems are that it's a black and white calendar, which is purposeful. Some people have suggested that we publish in color and then more people will want to buy it. But I happen to like the aesthetics of black and white, and somehow it seems to fit Nebraska. I think black and white can have a subtle beauty that isn't necessarily present in color, although color is wonderful too. And so we have to find artwork that reproduces well in black and white. We can't just go and find artwork that looks good and seems to have a similar theme. We also have to think about it, does it have sharp contrasts? So will it reproduce well in black and white? And another problem with getting the calendar out every year seems to be time, because I always overcommit myself to doing other things. So it's always nip and tuck. Are we going to get this out in time to sell enough before Christmas, before the holidays, to actually pay for the calendar? And so far it's mostly worked. And also I've had to contend with health problems, because through the years I've been doing this, I've had at least 2 surgeries, and I've gone through chemo, and I had a time when I was flat on my back because of a back problem for several months in a row, and had limited mobility after that. And yet we keep doing the calendar, and I think it's because either I'm crazy or I just love poetry so much that I want others to have access to it. People have also asked me how I go about choosing what poems should be in the calendar. It's not exactly like the 12, there's one poem for each month. It's not exactly like the 12 poems in the calendar are the 12 best poems in Nebraska. Because first of all, I have to deal with what's been submitted to me. And I will seek submissions from certain poets sometimes, and then I advertise in the newspaper. I'm always delighted to find poetry, good poetry by people I'd never heard of. And so that is one limitation on what poems we use. And then, of course, maybe the 12 best poems would be all by the same poet. Not exactly true, but I have to find 12 good poets. And then I want one for each month of the year, so maybe there's 5 wonderful poems for May and only 1 or 2 for December. And so they're not exactly the 12 best poems, but they're 12 poems I really believe in. And they are poems by some of the best poets in Nebraska. Over the years, we've published most of the poets that I happen to know of who are considered good poets in Nebraska, although there's always room to discover more. The calendar has been used in schools, and one thing I think about when I put it together is the audience, because I want the poetry to be good quality poetry, and I want it to reflect somehow the character of Nebraska, but I also want it to be something that can be used in classrooms, or something that you can give to your grandmother, or something that a tourist could pick up and it would tell them something about the nature of Nebraska. So I think about all those things. I also think about keeping a balance of male and female voices, and voices not just from Lincoln or eastern Nebraska, but from all across the state. So all those things together make the selection process a little bit intricate. And the calendar has ended up being an ambassador for Nebraska in several ways. It's I know that it's gone out to people in several different countries as well as people in other states. And that makes me feel good to think that people, besides just Nebraska, are reading poetry that is explicitly about Nebraska. Let's see. To publicize the calendar, I make as much use of free press as I can get. Send out press releases, and the newspapers have been actually willing to print my press releases, so then people hear and they send poetry in from across Nebraska, and then I again publicize it when it comes out, and people order it from across Nebraska, and I'm always amazed that people actually send in orders that I've never heard of, and as far as I know, they don't know any of the poets, but it's really rewarding to see people interested in actually buying the calendar, and sometimes people buy several so they can give them away as gifts, and I really appreciate that. I think I've probably told you enough about the process of how we put the calendar together, unless you have any questions about that right now. Okay. Then I would like to move on and read some of my poems. Sometimes I'm so busy working with other people's poetry that I don't really get to concentrate on mine as much as I like. The first poem I want to read is fairly new, as in the last couple years, and it's called Fishing. I never bait a hook, and may not even bring a pole. It is pleasant just to sit on the bank and watch the sunshine dance across the ripples, hear the gentle water slop against the rocks. Dragonflies, ancient, mysterious ones, float and dart among the weeds. Sometimes a family of ducks swims by, chuckling softly to each other. A turtle pokes its head out of the water and swims toward land, disappearing immediately if I move. A big fish jumps and plops back down, rings of ripples expanding from this temporary center of the universe, and I have been here to see. That poem is, of course, partly about just being by a lake and doing my equivalent of fishing, but I also wanted to read it sort of as a metaphor for going fishing for poetry and finding things that you're really privileged to find when you look for good poems. few more poems I want to read. This one was written for my daughter Maggie, and this was from Good Friday in 1994, so she was a little smaller than she is now. And she was out riding her bike and had an accident. We had to take her to the emergency room, which is one of those duties that parents know will probably occur sometime, but dread. I can do this. I can hold your hand. I can say, it's okay, Mommy's here. If I focus on your forehead, your rumpled pigtail peeking over your shoulder, anywhere but your wound. You are so brave. While they numb your chin with needles, you whimper, owie, owie. Squeeze out a few tears, but hold your head very still. Good girl. Though you can feel the thread pulling through your chin and hear the click of scissors clipping the thread at the end of each stitch, you do not protest. I try not to watch the surgeon's needle darting in and out of your flesh. Try not to focus on the slit gaping open to the wound. Or think of you speeding your bike down the sidewalk, braids flying behind you, not thinking about stopping until it's too late, slamming your chin into the blade-sharp corner of the neighbor's brick house, blood running down your face, arms, shirt, shoes. No, now I've done it. I've let myself think, let myself take part in your suffering. My face feels hot, yet strangely cold. My stomach twists, nearly explodes. I give your hand to the doe-eyed nurse and sit down, thinking, I cannot do this at all. I'd also like to read a poem. It's called For Gabriel, who is my cousin's son. But it's not really for Gabriel. Gabriel is who I was thinking about when I wrote the poem, but I'm not sure I would share it with him. Gabriel was born on my birthday, and so he was always special to me. But he grew up in Omaha and got mixed up in a crowd that had not so good of an influence on him, and eventually he was arrested for a drive-by shooting. He had actually shot someone he didn't even know from his car, or from a friend's car, and which shocked, of course, the whole family. But I wrote this poem in reaction to that. What angel can reach you now, slipping between the bars of your cell, floating above you as you lie on your cot, staring at the cracks in the ceiling? Getting in would be no problem. Angels don't need to show IDs to surly guards. They just appear. But would you notice? Perhaps when you were very young, you could hear angels singing in your sleep. But now you've stuffed your ears with hate, or worse, indifference. It must be so, or you could not have raised that gun and aimed not at a deer, but at a stranger, some kid hanging out at the wrong place at the wrong time. What were you thinking when you loaded your rifle with buckshot the way your grandpa taught you by the river in the crisp autumn air, when leaves were drifting off the trees and falling silently to earth without a cry? Why did you take that gun with you, cruising the city streets with friends, slowing to take careful aim? A greater thrill than catching a buck's eyes in your sights and taking him down? And now, what thrill is left as you memorize the ceiling cracks and dream of the life you could have led, the life you took away? If you could see the angel at your side, reaching out his arms to you, tears streaming like a mother's, could you open yourself like an unclenching fist to receive what you were hunting for, unknowing all along? And I'd like to end with sort of an ancient poem, but it's a poem that people have seemed to really enjoy through the years. So it's sort of like my signature poem, and I know a lot of you haven't heard it, so I'll go ahead and read it tonight. It's called Breakfast in Bed Poem. I actually wrote this when I was a college student. I'd like to buy, please, a breakfast in bed poem. Not one of those run-of-the-mill, burnt toast and orange juice models, mind you. No eggs or black coffee for me. I want a poem that pops out of my toaster and offers me flaming shish kebabs or caviar on ice, as well as performing the usual pre-breakfast duties of bringing in my morning paper, throwing open my curtains, and turning on my TV. And no ordinary TV either, but one with rabbit ears that flex and point when receiving music. When Lawrence Welk comes on, the ears grow soft and furry. The screen curves into a face. The on-button nose twitches nervously, and the feet thump like those of a real live rabbit who hops about the house, leaving colored eggs for the children. Crack open a green one and see a duck-billed platypus modeling legs pantyhose in a miniature commercial. Crack open a pink one and see the Pink Panther suspending Inspector Clouseau like a yo-yo from his long pink tail. The orange ones are westerns in which the horse kisses the cowboy and rides off into the sunset. In the white egg, at the bottom of the pile, is the embryo of a TV. The picture tube and frame are fully formed, but the dials and wires are rolled up in a ball of indistinguishable electrical components. It feeds on its yolk and grows till it becomes a gigantic TV set, stalking the world on its 4 wooden legs. It strides up to King Kong on the Empire State Building and flashes to him emergency transmissions of soap operas until Kong, engrossed in the stories, loosens his grip on the relieved Fay Ray, and she climbs down, ever so slowly, into my kitchen and fixes me breakfast in bed. Okay, the next poet who I would like to read is, let's see. Charles isn't here yet, is he? Okay, then I'll introduce Lucy Adkins, who was one of 4 daughters born into a farm family in Nance County, Nebraska. And her family were tenant farmers living on various farmsteads rented near Fullerton, Belgrade, and Genoa, until her parents purchased their home place when she was 15. She attended country schools and received her higher education at the University of Nebraska and Auburn University in Alabama. She has taught junior high and high school and has experienced many kinds of other jobs, everything from office work to serving as an emergency room assistant. She currently lives in Lincoln, where she works part-time at an insurance company. Most of the rest of her time is devoted to writing poetry and fiction and tending her garden. She is a member of the local Chaparral Poets, and she also writes songs as well as poetry. Besides the Nebraska Poets Calendar, her work has been published in the Owen Wister Review, Nebraska Territory, Midwest Poetry Review, Nebraska Life, and she has poems upcoming in Whole Notes and Woven in the Wind. Or are they out?
Not yet.
Okay, they're still upcoming. Woven in the Wind is an anthology of women's writing, which will be published by Houghton Mifflin. So welcome, Lucy Adkins.
Let's fix that. There. Thank you, Sarah. Okay. I want to start with a couple of bird poems. And I think I will start with the poem that's in this year's calendar in September. This poem came about because I was reading in the paper, and I heard on television, I believe it was last year, that in the town of Bassett, Nebraska, all of these wild turkeys were kind of taking over the town. And some of them were liking it, some of them weren't quite sure if they liked it or not. But this is the poem that came out of that. It's called News from the Sandhills. In Bassett, they say, the wild turkeys have come to town, moving in off the plains like grizzled old farmers to retire in comfort. Their wives, too, plump and saucy with a bit of red flannel at their throats, their gray and brown shawls trailing to the ground. See them in the afternoons, ambling 2 by 2 to the backyard feeders, or gathered in knots by the feed store, their wise old heads bobbing back and forth, scratching, talking of the old times, the price of grain, the weather. Thank you. This is another a bird poem, and this, I believe, was also for the month of September. I can't remember what year. I was also reading in the newspaper about the birds and how they were commencing on their annual migration, and the fact that the mourning doves were the very first birds to leave. Well, that fascinated me, and we were driving on Highway 80 West out to Minden, Nebraska. I was driving, and all of a sudden I said to my husband, right over there, write this down. And this is the first and only time I have ever dictated a poem, but it turned out pretty, I had to do a little work on it later, but this is the poem, Mourning Dove Migration, and thank you, Tom, for writing it down. They're the first to leave, singly or in family groups of 2 or 3, gone from the rooftops, gone from the telephone wires, gone from the puddles at the side of the road. Not in noisy symmetry like the Canada geese, filling the sky with the grandeur of their leaving, but quietly in a muffled flutter of feathers traveling south, and with them taking their plaintive calls at dusk, their grace, their meek dark eyes against soft gray. And it is not until evening, walking some days or weeks later, that we look and listen and wonder what it is we're missing, what it is we've lost. Thank you. I want to read this poem that I wrote. It was for a Chaparral Poets Conference, and the theme was to write about something Western. We were supposed to bring a roll call poem that was Western in flavor. I did not think I could write anything, but this is what I came up with, and it's called The Poet as Rodeo Queen. She's been watching the western skyline. She knows we're out there, bits and pieces of our lives drifting, fragments of dreams like yearlings strayed in the sagebrush. We're all a little lost. But the rodeo queen, our poet, has found us. She dons her broad-brimmed hat, a 10-gallon Dickinson, and with a whoop and a swish of her hair flies out of the chute. And oh, she is beautiful, metaphors glinting in the light, similes flashing. Her mount is sleek and shining, perfectly metered, then galloping wild and free, but straight to the point. And before we know what's happening, she's roping us in with her silver lariat, circling our thoughts, and in one fluid motion and a flourish, we're hog-tied, branded, punctuated with a good square knot. Looking truth in the face, we're frightened. We're all a little lost. our eyes wide and white, flailing out with our hooves, with all our being. But then we're free, up and trotting, shaking our woolly heads. If we let her, she guides us back to the ranch, to better grazing, sweet and tangy mouthfuls that make us what we are. They're what we need, because we're all just a little bit lost. I think I'll finish with two more poems from the calendar. This one, I believe, is from October, and it's called Each Autumn. Each autumn, the first freeze electric, like a light bulb burning out. Knowing it must come, still the shock, like 100 watts exploding, searing cheeks and fingertips, insides of noses. The shallow, tinkling sound of something lost, something broken, something more than primrose, baby's breath, forget-me-not, tomato vine blackening in the sun. Another summer fading from the insides of our eyelids, and we are left blinking and astonished. This last poem that I'm going to read is from the calendar, and it's one of the first poems I've ever published, and it was the first poem that ever appeared in the calendar. And I can remember the day that I got the letter from Sarah that this poem was going to be published. I was so happy. I was just dancing around. And so let's finish with that one. It's a good spring poem. This one came about in April, so we're in the right month. It's called Eating Daffodils.
Oh, boy.
Irene likes this one. We are what we eat, so let us eat daffodils, taking in the whole plant, from bright yellow petals to crunchy stems, a little golden pollen dust left on our chins for fun. When we smile, the light will dance from our eyes. We will bend and sway and whisper secrets to the grasses. We will stand by the roadsides and wave. And if the days grow warm, we will sweat the elixir of April, and ever on our tongues will be the wild, sweet tang of spring. Thanks very much.
That was really nice to listen to. I really enjoy those poems, but of course I selected most of them. I'd also like to introduce Robert King. And he graduated from the University of Iowa and worked at the Alaska Writers Workshop before teaching in North Dakota's English department. That's at the University of North Dakota in Grand Forks. And also at the Center for Teaching and Learning for most of his career. He's an emeritus professor? An emeritus professor, and he moved to Lincoln how many years ago? 5 years ago, so that he could spend more time with his writing, and his wife also had a full-time job here, and he tells me that he is going to be moving from here to Colorado, so we haven't had him for very long, but we've enjoyed reading his poetry and talking to him while he's been here. He's the author of 4 chapbooks, Standing Around Outside by Bloodroot Press, A Circle of Land by Dakota Territory Press, Learning American by Frank Catt Press, and Naming Names, which came out from Pelican Press. He has also published poetry in a variety of magazines, including Poetry, the Massachusetts Review, North Dakota Quarterly, Lowwater, South Dakota Review, the Nebraska Review, and Red Rock Review. And chapters of a full-length nonfiction work that he's written have appeared in his work is Stepping Out Again into the River, and they have appeared in Arkansas Review and Kansas Quarterly, North Dakota Quarterly, and South Dakota Review. And he had a poem in the 1998 calendar and then again in this year's calendar. I'd like you to welcome Robert King.
Well, thank you, Sarah, and for considering me a Nebraska poet, even if it was a very short time. I tried to get a reading here when I first came, thinking I'm a poet and I'm in Nebraska. So they said, well, it really helps if you were born here, and or maybe stayed here, well, more than the 2 years that we were at. And I went and blew it. I think it was 10 years was what I was told. And I have loved being in Lincoln, Nebraska, being in Nebraska and in Lincoln for many reasons, but certainly the community of readers and writers in this town is amazing. And there are more, from my experience, there are more poets per capita here in Lincoln than in, certainly than in New York or San Francisco, but even than in Iowa City, Iowa, where there is where there's almost a deadly concentration of there's two ways I could go about this poem in the calendar. I'm Mr. December, although you may. The drawing is not of me, so you don't have to worry. I could just not say anything about this poem, indeed not read it, and have you call Sarah in December and say, what the heck is this? Or I could explain it to you, and I've decided I will explain at least the form, because it's a very unusual form. It's called a pantoum, this form, P-A-N-T-O-U-M. It comes from Malaysia. I have no idea why. I do not know what it was before it was that. It's a series of 4-line stanzas. The second and fourth line of each stanza are repeated as the first and third line of the next stanza. The new second and fourth lines repeated as the first and third, etc., etc. And if you really want to tie up the package neatly, at the very end of the poem, you do have those first and third lines that weren't repeated, so you bring them down. It's hard to progress very quickly in a pantoum. But I really enjoy writing them, and I was delighted that Sarah picked this one, called Snow Pantoum. See, the other thing I could have done was just read it and try to pretend that there was just a few little repetitions there, but I thought I'd just make you really listen to it, and then when you read it, but not until December. You have to wait until December to read it, and I'm assuming if you don't have a calendar, you're certainly going to get one on your way out to do this. So I'm going to try to read it smoothly, but I also am going to try to emphasize it at the same time. It is December, remember, so this is not this season. The snow is falling this morning, which is not unexpected, this being that kind of winter, and I am losing myself, which is not unexpected, in the continual drift. I am losing myself in the final settling of the year. In the continual drift, everything still is buried in the final settling of the year. Almost all I am, now gone. Everything still is buried in a most visible absence. Almost all I am, now gone. A kind of timely loss. In a most visible absence, the snow is falling this morning. A kind of timely loss. This being that kind of winter. So you can kind of hear how that trickles down. I got a couple of little short ones. And boy, I'd submit into the calendar if I were going to be in next there, because they're both seasonal poems. One was written last autumn. It's a very short kind of thing. Actually, knowing Ted Kooser, if you've, I'm sure that many and or some have listened to his poetry, heard him read. I think some of Ted Kooser has rubbed off on me. He's not here, so I feel free to say that. very short, bing, so it's called seasonal. The last chipper cricket in autumn creaks its insistence. But when I edge out into the dark of my backyard, it silences cautiously. Perhaps I am winter. You could decide later on if you think that's really like it. So I will stop trying to do that. And this happened. This seems to happen almost every spring, and I'm perpetually amazed at it. Called gold when I walked in here. It was then called harvest, and right now it's called reaping. I better read it quickly before it all changes again. So reaping, as in the sense of harvest. After empty months, I sow black thistle seed into the plastic tube dangling from the bare tree in my forlorn backyard. 1/2 hour later, a finch arrives. 2 finches. 3. Everything is always around us, waiting simply, waiting. 3 more? Something like that? All right. I brought along one of the chapbooks that Sarah mentioned called Learning American. This is kind of part North Dakota with some references to Colorado. And actually I brought 5 copies along. I was going to try and make a few bucks tonight, but what I'm going to do is put it back there on the table, and people could buy it for $5, and then that will go to the Nebraska room or the calendar, or whoever's last person in the room. Come to think of it, but I did live in Grand Forks, North Dakota. We had a few floods while I was there. I left before the huge one 5 years ago, where all the town flooded and half of it burned. And I keep in touch with some friends, and it's still an issue there. So I thought, well, living along the river, which would be a poem from this chapbook for only $5, might have something to do with that. It's the Red River of the North is the river that goes through Grand Forks and Fargo and Wahpeton and ultimately Winnipeg. The river thins like one other thing I should tell you. Grand Forks got started because of a steamboat race between 2 captains who decided to spend the night then at a landing into what would be Grand Forks, broke out the beer, slept too late the next morning, and were frozen in to the river. And they decided to then start a town. And that's the kind of thing that's made America great. Those are the somewhat dubious circumstances of the origin of Grand Forks. That's very subtly referred to here. The river thins like an abandoned road, dropping each year in our attention. We have forgotten how we came by mistake, wintered in, how we'd been moving back and forth, how we'd settled, then thought of ourselves as passed by along the current, dreaming of the new towns, and now forgotten even the river's direction, the way the wind ruffles it backward in waves. In the middle, at a certain spot of swirl, a long pole hits the top of a car, sunken where we remember nothing happening, miss no one we can think of knowing. Only in spring, when the water swells, filling valleys of backyard smoothly and the pasture of the golf course where trees stand in their mirrors, do we have a moment of the old surprise. The town riding the surface, houses adrift with a sudden danger until the level falls to normal, settling us all back down. All summer now, we walk along the flood stage flats, the little flags of trash caught in a nest of thickets. Our daughters plan to marry boys we know. We've memorized the banks. At night, the river repeats our lights like spreading ice. That's the Grand Forks poem. I'll do 2 more things. I never know what to do with poetry reading. You know, it is wonderful to clap. Sometimes I tend Raised a Baptist, so there's a tendency in me after a poem to go, yes.
Amen.
I've never broken to that point, but there is this kind of, that's how I handle it. But one Kansas poem, one Colorado poem. I'll tell you, I am old enough so that when I was a child in Kansas, there was no such thing as air conditioning, I believe, or my parents treated us very cruelly and didn't tell us if there was that. But since the refrigeration was a large wooden box where a man brought a big hunk of ice with 2 tongs, calipers, whatever they were, I think there must have been no air conditioning. And occasionally they would let us, we would all go to sleep out in the yard, in the backyard on cots. I never woke up out in the yard, so I'm never quite sure what happened, and this is something to do with that. It's called Kansas Night. Because the little house those Kansas afternoons and evenings boiled like a tight white kettle, the sweat dripping from my mother's face, each spot a sizzle under the iron onto the fiercely starched white shirts, a damp handkerchief around my father's neck at dinner. When the evening came, we all moved out into the yard. Darkness seeped from the hearts of lilac bushes. The fireflies rose with their flickerings and fell while we lay on cots in the backyard, as large, it seemed to me then, as the dark sky itself, and they talked to each other in low voices that dimmed in my ears like stars I couldn't name. Later I would be carried, dead to the world, my mother used to say, who is dead to the world, back to my bed, older and confused in the morning, thinking I had imagined all of it, the stars, fireflies, the murmurings of those 2 who lay beside me, when I woke up alone in the thin sunrise. And a last, okay, I was going to try to beat you to it there. I actually wrote that before my mother died, but then after she did, I decided to just slip that in there. Growing up in, maybe it was just me. It wasn't where I grew up. It doesn't have nothing to do with North Dakota, Nebraska, Colorado, but I think it does. There were a lot of signs of something that had happened in Colorado. Mining towns that were there no longer. Strange things in a mountain clearing where something had been. Certainly North Dakota has its share of old farmhouses, and in Nebraska, as I've discovered, this weathered, empty, ghostly house usually has the family living right across the road in a much nicer house, thank you, and they just don't want to go to the trouble of taking it down. But in parts of, believe me, North Dakota, where the population, as the water rises, the population tends to fall. This was much the same in Colorado, except it does have the mountains, and this was a particular experience, reimagined more than half a century after it happened. Walking with Father, and then this will be my last poem. Growing up, I followed him back in time by the new reservoir, boards from drowned shacks still floating up. Or the convict cabins where, the year I was born, they cut a road through pines that lost itself, the clearing trash and bed springs sinking into the grass. I learned from hills of abandoned mines and towns that shrunk into ravines until one afternoon, heading for a timberline lake early in the season, he finally lifted me on his shoulders, his boots breaking through the snow crust, so my bones jarred as if I were feeling what it was like to walk for the first time. The lake was oval darkness in a hollow of white. Its meltwater creek would slow into the river through our town. Fingers aching, I swirled up icy glints of mica, quartz pebbles, the rows of feldspar. Then, dazed to the heart by the bright secrets of beginnings I could not even tell myself, I knelt and drank from the shining in my hands. Thanks very, very much. Thank you.